The famous right-wing politician Gösta Bohman once said, "When you have ignorant voters, which we have in Sweden, one is forced to simplify one's message, something ridiculous." This then makes us present a line of reasoning that sometimes crosses the boundaries of what is true. If we had informed voters who knew what was going on, we'd never be able to carry on this way. How is it that all of the democratic progress and welfare that the Western world has built up over a span of decades is now collapsing? For the past 40 years, we've watched the public sector being dismantled with constant budget cuts and changes for the worse in schools, healthcare, elder care, social safety nets, and infrastructure. And we're in a constant state of mass unemployment with extensive social exclusion and increasing organized crime. We see groups pitted against each other with increasing tensions and conflicts. At the same time, we see the entire foundation of democracy collapsing due to fact resistance and the spread of fake news, with growing mistrust of the political system. People have stopped expecting politicians to be able to solve any problems. Instead, politicians, the media, and the state have been designated as enemies. But how is it that while we're experiencing this permanent state of crisis and budget cuts, that the financial sector and business world are making extreme and historically unparalleled profits, and with increasing stock market speculation breaking new records year after year?
This is by design. It's the result of conscious political decisions that started being made 40 years ago. We have been told that it's not possible to have an extensive welfare for all citizens and at the same time have a profitable and competitive business climate that creates jobs. And therefore, the welfare must be cut. Otherwise, the business climate will suffer. Up until the mid-1970s, this binary opposition didn't exist. The Swedish welfare model was a unique example that had generated the world's highest standards of living and welfare for the entire population, while at the same time producing one of the world's most competitive and profitable business climates. Sweden went from being one of Europe's poorest countries to being one of the world's richest.
The Swedish welfare model was based on democratic influence over economic policy, which took into account all of society's interests, not just those of companies and the market. The model also resulted in more efficient interaction between all sectors of the economy. The basic idea was that high consumption and demand create growth, and that full employment and an extensive and efficient public sector was an effective tool for creating both welfare and quality of life for the population, as well as stable growth for the country. All of the public services produced by the public sector created an expansive and stable demand for goods and services, which were purchased from the country's businesses. In turn, this increased demand and the profitability of companies, which could then hire more people, make investments, and expand operations, which generated further consumption and more profitability for the companies. And the public sector also created tons of jobs, which increased the purchasing power and consumption of the population, which in turn increased demand and the profitability of companies. In addition, the welfare model helped make companies more competitive and profitable by providing them with the world's healthiest and most well-educated workforce, together with a highly developed infrastructure, government-funded research initiatives, free childcare for employees, and so on. The model is based on the fact that private and public sector consumption and expenditures at the same time constitute income for companies, while big budget cuts in the public sector, lowered wages, and unemployment lead to a national reduction in overall consumption. And this leads to increased unemployment, which further reduces consumption and further increases unemployment. a downward spiral where cuts in savings shrinks the country's whole economy. Unlike your own personal finances, a country cannot save money to increase resources.
But we have been told that the Swedish welfare model had merely been a naive utopia that didn't function, which instead had plunged Sweden into a very serious economic crisis. That the costs of all this welfare had stifled Swedish business and reduced its competitiveness. And we have been told that the Swedish welfare model had been funded with borrowed money, which bankrupted Sweden.
Vad folk inte vet om är att alla de här förklaringarna kommer från en spektakulär desinformationskampanj som lyckades korrumpera hela det svenska demokratiska systemet och manipulera befolkningen till att frivilligt vilja överge den här samhällsmodellen och stora delar av sin välfärd.
Within the business world of Sweden, there was a small but powerful group that altogether owned the entire Swedish export industry, and this group saw the Swedish welfare model as a roadblock to their financial interests.
The entire Swedish export industry was owned by the Wallenberg family and Industrivarden. They each owned a bank, SEB, and Handelsbanken, which had a central function for financing parts of the campaign.
Even on the international stage, the successful Swedish model was viewed as a greater threat to capitalism than communism, and therefore the Swedish example must be opposed.
Nu ville man istället införa en nyliberal ideologi och ekonomisk teori, där det uttalade målet var att ta bort det demokratiska inflytandet över den ekonomiska politiken och få alla politiska partier att föra samma ekonomiska politik. Makten över hur samhällets ekonomiska resurser ska fördelas ska bestämmas av företagen och marknaden och inte av folkvalda politiker. Politikens uppgift är istället att se till att rätt ekonomiska politik förs. Det vill säga hjälpa företagen med avregleringar, ekonomiskt stöd, skattelättnader, minskade skyldigheter.
According to the neoliberal economic theory, a country can only create growth through savings and deep cuts to the public sector and all jointly funded welfare. Pretty much all public service operations are to be deregulated and run by private companies. The public sector is seen as a cancer that does nothing but hinder growth, a parasite on the profitability of companies. According to the theory, the wages and consumption of ordinary employees must also be reduced. Only then can companies become more competitive and profitable. The premise is that companies hire more if it's cheap, not because of increased demand. In this model, full employment has no intrinsic value. On the contrary, a certain amount of unemployment is good for holding down wages and inflation.
Det som gör den nyliberala modellen så framgångsrik är också hur man så effektivt kan sälja in den till politiker och medborgare med en populistisk retorik som alla kan förstå. Där man likställer nationalekonomi med sin egen privatekonomi. Det vill säga att staten först måste skära ner på konsumtionen och spara för att kunna ha råd med utgifter i framtiden.
But how could you make an entire population want to abandon the Swedish welfare model if it worked so well?
För att lyckas använder man sig av strategin att iscensätta en påhittad kris. Man manipulerade all statistik kring Sveriges ekonomi för att bevisa att den svenska modellen inte fungerade och istället hade försatt landet i en allvarlig ekonomisk kris.
During the 1970s, a massive disinformation was spread about the Swedish welfare model. Sweden's foreign debt was exaggerated by 400%. The aim was to prove that the public sector was too expensive and grown too large, and that people's standards of living had become too high. The loss of export shares was exaggerated by over 100% and was a new notion made up in order to sound like economic science. The purpose was to prove that Swedish industries were in a crisis and could no longer compete internationally. The balance of payment deficit was exaggerated by 400%. The lie affected all economic debates, public opinion, and research in Sweden. The aim was to show that the nation and the Swedish people lived beyond their means, with extreme overconsumption, which the country's export industry was not able to finance. Companies' profits was presented as 300% lower than the real level of profit. With false statistics, a picture was presented of Swedish industry in a grave crisis due to too high real wages. Sweden's budget deficit was exaggerated by over 200%. The aim was to create a picture of Sweden in an economic crisis due to the Swedish welfare model. Claims and false statistics were spread, showing that the relative prices of Swedish exports increased by 100%. The aim was to give the impression that Swedish industries were in a crisis, with poor profits and declining competitiveness. The international inflation during the 1970s was presented as a specifically Swedish problem and as proof that the Swedish welfare model did not function. The truth was that Sweden's inflation was on the same level as the rest of the world, as a consequence of the rising oil prices. One of the most significant false claims was that the public sector in Sweden increased more rapidly than in other countries. They alleged that it comprised 60% of GDP, when in fact, the public sector in Sweden grew at the same rate as this sector in the rest of the world and comprised only 28% of GDP. The disinformation induced the Swedish people to believe that strong labor unions and sloppy governments allowed wages to rise faster in Sweden than in other countries. The media were proclaiming wage explosion, but the real statistics shows that wages in Sweden rose more slowly than in almost all other industrial countries. The core of the propaganda was the claim that Swedish people had been living beyond their means, with a far too high standard of living. All the welfare in the country's huge public sector had encouraged a dangerous overconsumption. But the truth was that Sweden had one of the smallest increases in consumption, both private and public, of all industrial countries. The false statistics portrayed Sweden as the world's largest borrower, when Sweden has in fact borrowed less than most other countries. The depiction of reality was that the Swedish export industry financed the Swedish welfare model, when in fact a major part of Sweden's GDP was comprised of services, not of goods. The crisis within the old basic industries, shipbuilding, steel, and textiles, composed only of 2.8% of Swedens GDP.
Man piskade upp en krisstämning som sa att det var bråttom att genomföra extrema ekonomiska reformer för att rädda landet. Det var egentligen väldigt raffinerat. Man utnyttjade den internationella olje- och industrikrisen som drabbade alla länder under den här tiden. Och man framställde effekterna av de här internationella kriserna som ett bevis på att just Sveriges ekonomi hade allvarliga strukturella problem som var orsakade av den svenska välfärdsmodellen. Så genom att använda en redan existerande kris kunde man docka an sin egen påhittade kris. Det här var ett effektivt sätt att spela på människors rädslor och att sedan sprida sin desinformation som förklarade vad orsaken var till den här allvarliga krisen.
In the 1960s, the campaign's own secret research agency began looking for new ideas to influence public opinion in favor of the campaign's own interests. Through their international networks in the US and UK, they learned completely new controversial methods, which the campaign's notorious spin doctor Sture Eskilsson then adapted into specific Swedish contexts. In 1971, he presented a completely new strategy that he called qualified opinion formation. Implementing the new strategy required unlimited financial resources, and these new methods would take political influencing to a whole new level, which was also necessary to guarantee a stable and sustained change in Sweden's economic policies. This new influencing of public opinion wasn't just targeted at voters in the run-up to parliamentary elections like usual. The goal was instead to introduce a completely new narrative for society as a whole, to change the direction in economic research and in the national government, and they even wanted to make their political opponents, the Social Democrats, believe the new narrative. And this influencing of public opinion would be non-stop, year-round, year after year, not just during elections. They created a centralized campaign organization that was globally unique in its strategic structure and extensive scope, whereby a great number of seemingly independent think tanks and pseudo-scientific institutes produced mountains of facts and analysis that were then used to systematically influence the media, politicians, and economists. It was disinformation with a clear message that the Swedish welfare model didn't work and had plunged the country into an economic crisis. The massive organization and all its players created their own ecosystem with production and distribution of ideological facts and analysis, where every segment of society was to be influenced and taught about the new business ideology. Through the media, it was also possible for the campaign to effectively disseminate its tailor-made populist messages and analysis, that now everyone could be experts in economics. All of the seemingly independent economists that made critical statements in the media against the Swedish welfare model were in fact employed by the campaign organization. The campaign's research institutes offered very generous financing and career opportunities, which made it very easy to corrupt economists to work for the organization. In this way, they could get many social democratic economists to change sides and begin to condemn the Swedish welfare model. It is also interesting to see that through this enormous organization, the actual sender of the messaging could be concealed. Instead, they created the illusion of a popular opinion, where a wide range of seemingly independent institutes, experts, economists, journalists, and debaters all happened to share the view that the Swedish model didn't work, that the crisis was very serious, and that the only salvation was to immediately accept all economic reforms and cuts.
The fact that the campaign had succeeded in corrupting the country with falsified statistics was officially proven in the mid-1980s in conjunction with Statistics Sweden having to make a number of corrections to the country's national accounts.
Förklaringen man gav var att det bara handlade om slumpmässiga räknefel som inte hade påverkat några politiska beslut. Men det märkliga var att alla de här räknefelen råkade visa samma sak. Att den svenska välfärdsmodellen hade försatt landet i en allvarlig ekonomisk kris. Och det hade ju faktiskt varit med hänvisning till just den här falska statistiken som man hade motiverat nödvändigheten av att skrota den svenska modellen och införa världens mest extrema ekonomiska reformer. De ekonomiska reformerna som infördes fick också enorma konsekvenser på Sveriges ekonomi. Eftersom Sverige inte hade befunnit sig i någon kris som berodde på den svenska välfärdsmodellen och eftersom man hade genomfört alla ekonomiska reformer baserat på den här felaktiga statistiken och analyserna, så fick reformerna allvarliga konsekvenser på ekonomin. I själva verket hade reformerna skapat reella ekonomiska problem för Sverige. Vilket också var en medveten strategi. För nu hade man en verklig kris som hela tiden visade på hur skadlig den svenska modellen var. Och man kunde ständigt peka på nödvändigheten av att införa ännu fler ekonomiska reformer och nedskärningar. Alla brutala ekonomiska reformer med 5 devalveringar och andra åtstramningsreformer försatte Sverige i en 20 år lång lågkonjunktur. Det var alltså en politiskt beslutad lågkonjunktur och den enda förklaringen till varför Sverige hade världens lägsta tillväxt under 20 år. Inget annat land i världen har gjort något liknande. Orsakerna bakom den här lågkonjunkturen har också granskats. Men det har gjorts av kampanjens egna ekonomer som själva stod bakom de här reformerna. Men genom den massiva desinformationen kunde man få det svenska folket att tro att lågkonjunkturen istället berodde på den svenska välfärdsmodellen. Och man accepterade därför hela tiden nya omfattande nedskärningar och försämringar. Reformerna hade däremot gjort finansiärerna bakom kampanjen, alltså exportindustrin, kapitalägare, finansmarknaden, enormt förmögna. Och den här politiskt beslutade överföringen av pengar från löntagare och den offentliga sektorn till finansmarknaden och delar av näringslivet skapade också ett överflöd av pengar och vinster som även spädde på en enorm spekulation på börsen. Stockholmsbörsen slog till och med världsrekord 5 år i rad under den här tiden.
This went exactly as planned by the economists behind the new economic theory, using financial crisis as a strategy to quickly push through extreme economic reforms that would have otherwise been democratically impossible to get past. We have therefore been in a permanent state of financial crisis since this new economic model was introduced 40 years ago. Crisis that constantly requires cuts and changes for the worse, for the people and society, while at the same time further enriching the financial market and capital owners. So you could say that we now have a parallel financial system that is completely outside all forms of democratic influence, while at the same time this state of affairs is presented to be neutral economics, free from ideology.
Den officiella historieskrivningen kring varför det blev nödvändigt att överge den svenska välfärdsmodellen beskrivs fortfarande idag med kampanjens statistik och analyser, där man blandar ihop effekterna av den internationella olje- och industrikrisen med den påhittade krisen orsakad av den svenska modellen. Och man fortsätter sedan att blanda ihop de skadliga effekterna som de extrema ekonomiska reformerna hade orsakat, med föreställningen att skadorna på landets ekonomi istället berodde på den svenska välfärdsmodellen.
This is a textbook example of a successful disinformation campaign where you strategically use a crisis and then develop alternative narratives with your own facts and analysis that suit your own agenda. Since there is an actual true crisis, the fake analysis and narratives that are spread in the media automatically becomes true as well.
This enormous societal change is now seen as completely uncontroversial and as a natural societal development. A view that the welfare model had been a naive utopia that was too good to be true. And still today, it's a completely foreign idea to think that this enormous societal change stemmed from a centralized campaign run by the business world.
This paradigm shift took place throughout the Western world. A new ideology and economic theory was introduced with the aim of transferring power over economic policy from the citizens to the business world and the markets. It was a social model that would limit democratic influence and make politics meaningless, where people stop having any expectations for politics to solve any societal problems. As a consequence, we have a paralyzed political system that can no longer solve any societal problems because it's governed by an economic theory that requires constant cuts and austerity measures. Where politicians think it's their job to say that only the market and the business world can and should solve societal problems. And where it doesn't matter which political party the citizens vote for, because all of the parties support the same economic policy. Today, we're also seeing the emergence of a new type of politician, one who compensates for their powerlessness by heavily relying on symbolism and populist ploys. When the people see that politics can't solve any problems, social tensions increase, and therefore the solution is to blame problems on other groups. And more people start seeing the political system, scientific facts, and the media as their enemies. We have been told that our current model of society is the best alternative, despite the fact that after 40 years, it still hasn't been able to create a better functioning society or greater welfare. The gap has never been greater between reality with all of its societal problems and the continued ideological message that the society and population must save money and cut back on spending if it wants things to be better in the future. But all the permanent societal problems and increasing discontent demonstrates the need for a better way. Just imagine that this political and ideological shift wasn't a natural development of society, but instead due to a massive disinformation campaign that got us to toss out the Swedish welfare model, which was actually a model that worked. A model that benefits all segments of the population and the business world. A model that also strengthens the democratic system.